One of the things that I think is really important to understand about Charles Dickens is how young he was when he became a literary celebrity. That incredibly ambitious, aspirational boy who realized when his parents were not going to provide a proper education for him, he gets himself a job as a clerk, teaches himself shorthand, starts to do the parliamentary reporting, travels by stagecoach all around England, and then starts writing for money and has a big hit straight out of the gate with sketches by Boz and then the Pickwick Papers. And the Pickwick Papers is an instant sensation. And then he keeps up this pace, just one novel after the next. He's not only writing novels, but he's also editing different journals all the year round, later Household Words. He's giving tours. He goes to America for 6 months, still as a young man. At that point, he had 4 children that he and his wife, Catherine, left at home with friends. And he's really good friends with artists and other writers of the time. Actors, the famous Macready is a close personal friend of Charles Dickens. And when he goes to America, he meets Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He meets Edgar Allan Poe. He meets Ralph Waldo Emerson. Poe and Dickens initially kind of liked each other. Poe was an admirer of the young Charles Dickens, but then Dickens wrote some kind of snarky things about American poetry and slighted Poe, and the relationship turned hostile. Emerson was a little bit more guarded in his estimation of Dickens, and so what's interesting is part of what Dickens experiences in America is class snobbery. So Dickens, remember, he's the son of a naval clerk. That puts him kind of lower middle class. But his mother actually comes out of the servant classes. And so that's something that the family kind of hides. So he's very aspirational, but his family's been in prison. He's worked in a factory. He's basically been a street kid during a period in his life. He didn't go to university. So he's kind of rough around the edges. And you've got these American aristocrats. You've got, the literary lights from Yale and Harvard who are looking at this guy in a red waistcoat. He would wear really flashy clothes, and he was known for being kind of a dandy. So he's got that kind of new money vibe to him. He has this dramatic, long flowing hair. He was described as really handsome, but that he's a little bit kind of tacky. And a little bit too much of the theater and too much of the self-made man. So those of you who are saying, hey, wait a minute, this kind of slam against Bounderby, at least the fiction of Bounderby, for pulling himself up by his bootstraps, there's a little bit of that kind of insecurity in maybe Dickens's own kind of pedigree that we see in the caricature of Bounderby, right? And in fact, Catherine Dickens, Catherine who ultimately Dickens separates from, right, when he has his relationship with Ellen Ternan, Catherine Dickens is perceived as some Americans as being of a higher social class than her husband, which she was, according to the values of that time. Her family was from Scotland. They were a successful literary family. And one of the reasons the young Charles was attracted to Catherine is because this is a marriage that looks good on paper, which is what some of you were saying about maybe Louisa and Bounderby, right? Marriage is one of those few opportunities that you have in the Victorian world to change your social status. So he becomes increasingly famous and popular, and then as he enters into kind of his artistic maturity, the tone of his novels changes. So you have Dombey and Son in 1848 as kind of the first mature novel, and then you get into the dark novels. So Bleak House, Hard Times, Little Dorrit, and we can see in the tone of his works the less comedy maybe more cynicism, more edge. A lot of people really like the later novels, and I'm in that crowd, which maybe kind of says something about our own taste. You know, the young kind of comedic, fresh, idealistic novels. It's like, yeah, they're fun, but you know, give us the really dark stuff. Throughout the 1860s, Dickens is giving public readings of his novels, famously reading the murder scene from Oliver Twist. If you know the story of Oliver Twist, you know Bill Sikes, you know Nancy. If you've seen the musical of Oliver Twist, you know what happens to Nancy. And Dickens reportedly would get so worked up performing these different roles because he's performing Nancy being beaten to death. He's performing Bill Sikes as the murderer, that he would get off the stage and just collapse from exhaustion. He dies relatively young, right? He dies in his late 50s from an apparent stroke. And he would often kind of write to the brink of exhaustion. And so a lot of the kind of financial insecurity that you see in people who have been through hard times, right? I'm never going back to that. I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure that I am financially secure. That seems to be a good part of the drive behind Charles Dickens, but also that he had this incredible energy and vitality and kind of creative genius. And that was something that the Americans who didn't really like him, who thought, you know, who's this flashy upstart, you know, who's really kind of from a lower class than we had expected. But they would write about his face. That when you looked at the face of Charles Dickens, that it was incredibly animated, that it would change with each expression, that his eyes sparkled, that they were so full of life and intelligence, and that he just kind of blotted out everybody else in the room. Like, he was so charismatic, you couldn't look at anyone else when he was there. So he dies at Gad's Hill Place. There's some speculation about, and Dickens was living there with his children. So Catherine, the wife, goes away. They have an unhappy separation. Dickens loses a lot of friends over the separation. He actually makes kind of a public justification of it that doesn't go very well, because a lot of contemporaries said, you know, there isn't really a gracious way to explain to your adoring public why you've separated from your wife. You know, we're not going to see it from your point of view. But he's the household manager. He's very much kind of a micromanager and hands-on, so he's running his household. But when he has this stroke, Ellen Ternan, who has been living in a separate household, speculation she's kind of rushed to Gad's Hill Place and then rushed away before all the news coverage of his death. So Hard Times itself, 1854 is when it's written, serialized in household words over a 5-month period, which is pretty fast. Some of the novels I shared are written over a period of 18 months and published over that time. Only 25 named characters compared to 79 in Bleak House. And that means that there are lots of other, in the big novels, there are lots of other unnamed characters, right? You've got this incredibly complex social world in the big multi-plot novels. He targets problems of industrialization and this excessively utilitarian or pragmatic thinking. And throughout his life and throughout like his tour in America, Dickens is really interested in using art as a way to address social problems. And he gets pretty disenchanted in the political process, right? We see that in his description of the members of Parliament. He calls them dustmen. They're garbage men, but we said that dust is a euphemism for waste or excrement. So all they're doing is just shoveling around waste at each other. And so what he does retain hope in, and you see this till the end, and by the way, if you're a Dickens fan, his last novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, he dies before it's finished. And it's a murder mystery. And for years I thought, I will not read Edwin Drood. That's going to be too painful. I resisted. Just this last year I finally read Edwin Drood, and that was my last Dickens novel. And as soon as, of course, I get to the last page he wrote, I thought, why did I do this? This is the stupidest thing I've ever done, because you're never going to know. But it's a fascinating book, and it goes way darker than his other novels, and it starts to read much more like a real late 19th century or early 20th century book. It's about an opium addict. So you get these scenes in these opium dens in London, really different and really kind of surreal and spooky, more like a Robert Louis Stevenson kind of, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of stuff. So if you want to torture yourselves, read The Unfinished Mystery of Edwin Drood. So he's always looking for ways to address social problems, but he ultimately kind of retains his faith in the individual. It's not going to be the politicians who figure it out. You might get politicians to follow the people with good hearts. If you have enough like artists who speak their truth, and you have enough readers and listeners out there who understand, they get the message. They get the message about children being exploited in factories. They get the message about women being exploited in the marriage market, right? If enough kind of good readers understand, then maybe they can exert the political pressure. And part of that sense of kind of disillusionment and process came from Dickens' touring of America. He, like many Europeans, many progressive Europeans, had thought, wow, here's this brave new democracy. I bet that's a place where, the brotherhood of man, really exists, and there's really social equality. And that's not what Dickens experienced in 19th century America in the 1840s, which tells you again how young the United States was at that time, right? So he kind of comes home disillusioned in the ideal of an achievable egalitarian democracy and puts his faith on individuals instead. So we haven't talked yet about the structure of the novel. There's a typo, sorry, in that slide. It's organized around the ideas of sowing, reaping, and garnering is what that last word should say. So what's that about? Sowing, reaping, and garnering. I'm going to ask you to talk to someone near you and explain what the titles mean and why the book is organized this way. What have the characters garnered as a result of what they have sown and reaped? And I heard lots of you in your group saying, you reap what you sow, right? But this garnering part is important too. So what are they going to have to live with now?
They have to live with the consequences of their actions. What Louisa and you can tell from the fact that of her almost affair, how greatly it affected her and how it kind of brought about all these emotions for her, and what it's done to change her as a person too. She has to live with that now. Tom has to live with his actions, and everyone across the board has, they did what they did because of the persons that they are. But there's no escaping what they have done and what it's bringing about.
Okay, excellent. Really well said. And we looked at how that final moment after Louisa has escaped Hart House, right? And she sends Sissy Jupe as her ambassador to tell him the only honorable thing you can do now is leave. And he's like floored by that. He's like, this is so ridiculous. And who are you? And you're making me feel awkward and embarrassed and I have to get out of town. But Sissy, because she's one of the kind of the proxies for the angel in the house, right? Because you have these dysfunctional households. They're not living up to the Victorian ideal. So you have Rachel and you have Sissy. Sissy has that kind of moral authority just by the presence of her virtue. She's able to compel Hart House to do what nobody else could do, and certainly not what Louisa could do. Louisa, she didn't have the virtue, she didn't have the sensibility to be that guard against his attempts at seduction. So although she's not guilty of the actual act, remember how when she lays this all at the door of her father and says, this is what you've created, and she starts to swoon, and her father catches her, and she's like, no, let me drop to the ground. We need to complete this act. I'll die if you keep me upright. So what happens to Louisa? What is her fate? She says that she's spoiled. She tells her father, you've spoiled me. You've ruined me. And the ruined woman is another expression for the fallen woman. Does she get redeemed? What do you think? Is there a happy ending for her? What does she get to do into the future? What has she garnered?
She becomes a mother.
Well, she becomes kind of like an aunt to Sissy's children, and she's able to live vicariously through their childhood and experience a childhood through children's eyes.
Good. So she becomes kind of a pseudo mother, right? She doesn't get to remarry after Bounderby dies. So what does that tell you about Bounderby? Does he get redeemed? No, he gets killed off. So we were not supposed to like him or hope for his redemption. But Louisa has this kind of ambiguous space that she's going to occupy in the life, the afternight life of the novel. She gets to be kind of a satellite on the charmed domestic circle. She doesn't get to be the moral center of a household. So she is compromised to a certain extent. Okay, how about Gradgrind now? Does he get redeemed? Okay? But
I can't see how he can get redeemed. He has to live with the product of his ideology. And he knows absolutely now that he's a flawed instructor, and his teachings weren't the correct teaching.
mm-hmm.
He allowed no emotion into his,
Mm-hmm.
to his instruction.
Mm-hmm.
So no, I don't think he's redeemed at all. It'd be a terrible thing to have to live in that house. As a father to that though.
Mm-hmm.
Just to add on to that, as George's remarks, not only did he fail as a teacher with his school, but he failed as a father and as a husband, father to his children, as a husband to his wife
Mm-hmm.
as well.
Right, you think about kind of the total devastation of the family. You think what happened to Tom.
I don't want to completely disagree, but I also want to point out that he should deserve some credit for realizing that he had made a mistake and trying to fix that. When Bounderby comes in later and says, well, bring her back to my house by noon tomorrow, or I'm bringing her stuff back here.
Mm-hmm.
And Gradgrind's like, well, that's unreasonable. She's
Mhm.
been through a lot. There's been mistakes made. I've made mistakes. You've made mistakes. We've all made mistakes. And I think we need some time to sort this out. And I think that if it doesn't make him completely redeemed, I think it puts him at least on the step to where you can't say that he's totally unredeemable. Words.
Yeah,
I don't
Mhm.
think the awareness of the mistakes, though, redeems the
But an attempt to correct them does.
Okay, really good.
He tried.
Okay, excellent. Danielle and then Megan.
I agree with Hayden in so much as I'm a parent now, grandparents, and honestly, it's like so tough. I just want to smack my kids in the head sometimes for the stupid mistakes they made, but I was their trainer. So you have to accept that responsibility, and in the end, just the fact that Hayden said in his linguistic sensibility, he is even recognizing you have to be of reason. He never uses that word, ever.
Mhm.
It's always facts, until that swooning of Louisa, and then he starts to maybe recognize. Fully redeemable? No. Possibly a little angel like Sissy in his mind, maybe thinking later in his, mind, his heart, that it's opened a little bit of crack.
Mhm.
Enough to, recognize, I guess, is all I can really say. I was trying to search for other terms, but that was a difficult scene to get through, building upon a redeemed father who knows how badly he's behaved and what he's done.
Good. So he experiences repentance. We don't know maybe if he experiences salvation. Megan gets the last word, and then we'll save the rest for the seminar.
I was just gonna say I agree with everyone, and you see both. It's like he could potentially be redeemed, but he started to do the right thing at too late of a time. And I think, like it says, here was Mr. Gradgrind on the same day and in the same hour, sitting thoughtful in his own room. He's by himself with his own thoughts. That's that he has to live with over what he's caused to happen. And then just below it, it says, bending his hitherto inflexible theories to appointed circumstances, making his facts and figures subservient to faith, hope, and charity. He understands that he hasn't always been right, but he's done what he's done for so long, it's too late to try to change him. And so I don't know if that means that he can be fully redeemed
Right.
or not.
The sowing and the reaping have already happened, right? What they have to live with now is whatever's already in the barn, okay? So, well done.